I'm sitting in one of the JSE listed companies. I'm reviewing an integrated report. Top on the risk register as what's happening in the Middle East. International trader. How is the war in the Middle East going to impact my business? Because my business is exposed to global commodity, global fluctuations in terms of global commodity prices, is exposed to global supply chain disruptions. I'm trying to make sense of this. How do I quantify this risk as a CEO sitting in a boardroom of one of the JSE listed companies?
Look, I think the developments in the Middle East are a tremendous strength to global trade. And the escalation of the conflict from Israel to Palestine, and now the involvement of Iran, is posing a great threat to global trade. And of course, you've seen with the blockade of the trade route, which is a consequence of this conflict. And it's very difficult to understand what the eventual outcome, because that speaks to the political settlement of a conflict that has been going on for over 70 years. And it's very difficult to run any model that will give a precise determination of how this thing is going to look like in the final analysis. But maybe let me just give a historical context at least to allow. The partitioning of Israel was done by the British post the Second World War. The last governor of Palestine was a chap called Lord Balfour, who used to compare himself to Pontius Pilate, the man who crucified Jesus Christ, who was the governor of Palestine in the first century. And they partitioned this piece of land, which is the size of Kruger National Park, to try and accommodate Ashkenazi Jews that were fleeing persecution from Europe. They did this without consent from the Palestinian people. But I think the concession that came from the Palestinian people to allow a two-state solution, which is what the world is trying to achieve, is a great concession that came from people who had to be subjected to the kind of conditions that are subjected to now. So this is a state that has a territorial problem. So Israel is driven by a couple of things, geopolitically. One is driven by territorial integrity, because of its size. Because it's so small, it cannot take punishment. You know, South Africa is a vast country. If we were to be bombed here, we can run to the Northern Cape. There's still some pieces of land. Israel can't take punishment. That's why you have an Iron Dome, because the territory is that small. That's the first point. So territorial integrity is everything to Israeli policymakers and how it conducts itself geopolitically. The second point is that because this is a settler colonial project, it was founded on racial and ethnographic grounds. So creating a state for the Jewish community. We must protect it. So it's going to protect itself physically through its walls. It protects itself through the legislation, the regulation around how Palestinians interact with Israelis is highly regulated. Because if I were to just make an example, and I'm saying this thing just to highlight the complexities around solving this particular problem. If you look at the demographics, if you look at the Palestinian family, for instance, you have about 5-6 kids in a family. Then look at the Israeli, looking about plus minus 3. So if you were to open up borders, just make an example, and these are things which are often not said. If we open up borders and the influx of Palestinians into that part of the territory would actually lead to an extinction of the state of Israel, and would begin to undermine the very doctrine that it was founded on. So it would be extinction by osmosis, just from the sheer numbers. So what you have is a very protective state that has to be offensive in its posture for survival. Yeah.
So now, let's look at a number of events that have taken place talking about Israel and South Africa's involvement. I mean, we took Israel to the International Court of Justice. And on December 29th, 2023, South Africa initiated proceedings against Israel before the ICJ, seeking provisional measures. And on January 26, ICJ issued its order on these measures following South Africa's request. Now, the United States of America is obviously not happy. Why is Israel so important to the United States of America?
Yeah, I mean, there's a multitude of reasons. The most influential lobby in Washington is the Jewish lobby. It's quite influential in the policy-making disposition in the United States. You have seen to an extent where some people in Washington feel that the Israeli government has actually undermined the US because they're not listening to the United States, because American politics is structured differently. Lobbyists are the most powerful group of people that drive policy making, particularly in Washington. But coming back to this point about the United States being very unhappy with us, they would be very unhappy. Because one, what we have done is something which was completely unexpected. We've used international legal mechanisms. And it doesn't matter what the outcome of this process is, but what it has done is that it has chronicled and documented a crime of genocide that is unfolding in the 21st century. So that there's not even debate for posterity about what has happened now. And indeed, it is a crime of genocide that's taking place in Palestine. And unfortunately, this particular administration, which has been most disappointing, because in the past we've seen Republican administration being slightly more aggressive than Democrats. And then what we're seeing with Biden's administration has been particularly disappointing. There is an ongoing slaughter and extermination of the people in the West Bank. They have no place to run. They cannot hide. They are locked in the strip. I know now there's been some aid that has been going through, but the bombing hasn't stopped. As we speak now, they're still suffering that onslaught.
So now, just to come in there, I mean, there's been, going back to the issue of the relationship between the United States of America and South Africa. I mean, you know that from the start of 2023, there's been this tension between U.S. and South Africa, which started with the joint naval drill with Russia and China, also coinciding with the one-year anniversary of the Ukraine-Russia war. Now, the U.S. is unhappy. They put through the House of Representatives Resolution 145. I would like us to unpack Resolution 145 because it's calling on the Biden administration to conduct a comprehensive review of the U.S. South Africa relationship. Now, the situation, as you know, intensified, I think, in May 2023, when the U.S. ambassador publicly accused South Africa of covertly supplying weapons to Russia for use against Russia. I mean, these are serious allegations that they're making against us. Another accusation that's been made against South Africa is that South Africa has a history of siding with terrorist organizations like Hamas. And also go on to say Hamas is a proxy for Iran. They also accuse South Africa of pursuing closer relations with People's Republic of China, been accused of pursuing closer relationships with the Russian Federation. Now, are they responding to South Africa's shift in terms of foreign policy? What are we dealing with here in terms of, if we were to assess the risk that we're dealing with here? Because we're getting involved in issues. Are we getting involved in issues that don't have anything to do with this?
No. Look, I think there's a broader strategic shift geopolitically from the west to the east. The world has moved from bipolarity, where there were two centers of power, and there was a period where there's just the U.S. Now we're moving towards a multipolar. So it's multipolarity. We're talking about multipolar game theory. That's the global context that we're dealing with now. And South Africa has to position itself cleverly in this context. The resolution 145, of course, I think the U.S. government has got to react. Those that are responsible for U.S. South Africa relations are quite embarrassed to some extent by the extent to which we're pursuing our foreign policy. So there's got to be some reaction. But even in Washington and in Capitol Hill, there's no consensus about how best to move forward. But I think if we just look at the resolution itself, it speaks a lot about South Africa's relationship with the People's Republic of China. And it isolates this. It doesn't look at it from the context of BRICS. Because part of the issue with that is that BRICS has some of the US allies. India, Saudi Arabia, and a few other strategic countries that are part of BRICS Plus now, with the latest development. So it isolates South Africa's relationship with Russia. With China. Unfortunately, I don't see it progressing to an extent where it becomes something catastrophic for us. And there are reasons why I think so. The first one is that South Africa has got to act in its own economic interest. That's number one. Any country must act in accordance to its own national security or economic interest. South Africa's relationship with China is a very important relationship. China is our largest trading partner. China is part of our BRICS formation. And by the way, BRICS is now the largest formation in the world. Represents the biggest global consensus of humanity, which we've never seen before. Its GDP has now eclipsed the G7 GDP combined. The military combined has eclipsed the G7 combined. So this is a new formation that is changing the global dynamics, and South Africa is at the heart of that change.
So why is South Africa being punished then? Because I'm just going to unpack something here in terms of the U.S. SA Bilateral Relations Review Act. Obviously, it was triggered by Resolution 145. So this act, if enacted, it would compel the Biden administration to reassess several aspects of our relationship. And that includes the significant trade benefits South Africa currently receives. By way of example, the AGOA, right? And now, just to quote from the same resolution, it says here, once enacted, no later than 30 days after the date of enactment, the President, in consultation with the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Defense, shall certify to the appropriate congressional committees and release publicly an unclassified determination explicitly stating whether South Africa has engaged in activities that undermine United States national security or foreign policy interests. I mean, if you are sitting as the Minister of Foreign Affairs of South Africa, how would you interpret that? Is that not a threat to South Africa's economic interests?
No, it is a big threat, without a doubt. And look, I mean, having said all of these things, America, the US is still a very important partner for South Africa. It's the second largest trading partner we have. And so it is a threat, and it's not to be underestimated in any way. But maybe we must just contextualize this relationship and look at it and give a slightly quantitative analysis of what the implications are for it. If you look at what Americans are getting in our relationship, South Africa is still going to be quite significant from a commodities point of view. The extractive industry, we have some of the commodities that are unsubstitutable. South Africa has 80% of the manganese reserves in the world. South Africa has about 70% of the platinum reserves in the world. We're supplying about 100% of chrome to the US market. So for the United States to cut that off completely, there will be serious ramifications for their own steel and automotive industry and other related industry. So it's not the easiest decision.
Okay. Let's work with one scenario. Just while you're talking about the impact of could the potential exclusion of South Africa from AGOA, let's say, I mean, given the background and the context that you just shared, based on a shift in foreign policy, could it affect the entire SADC, given that South Africa itself is the economic hub of the SADC region? So expulsion from the AGOA agreement, don't you think the impact will not only be felt here, but will be felt in the entire SADC region?
Yeah, no, that's an interesting question, and let me also just go back and give a bit of historical context around AGOA. So it was Bill Clinton who was president when it was concluded, and the reason why it started was actually to try and provide a market for South African agricultural goods in particular. That's how it started. Because of the subsidies that the US government is providing for US farmers to keep prices very low in the agricultural sector. So AGOA was started for that reason, to say we're going to have a tariff-free dispensation, because that's what it is. It's a preferential tariff regime. In the US, they call it the harmonized tariff system. That we will allow your agricultural goods to come and access the US market. That's how it was started. And of course, then they started adding other sectors, including the automotive sector. But if you quantify that and you're looking at the actual impact and you're looking at the income in terms of GDP that we're deriving from AGOA, per se, as a preferential regime, you'll be surprised. I mean, it won't be as catastrophic. So I'll give you throw in some few statistics. So the concentration of South African export basket has been diversified to a large extent. The agricultural export particularly, which would be mostly affected by AGOA, is about 7% that goes to the US. 27% of that is going to East Asia, about 19% of that is going to the European Union. So about 7% is going to the US. And that's within then the AGOA parameters. And then of course you've got the automotive sector, which would probably be one of the hardest hit if we were to be removed from that preferential regime. I think there may be some contraction of about 16%. But of course, there's a greater market even for that sector. So if you look at it quantitatively, it won't really be the end of the world. What would be most detrimental and damaging would be the perception that is behind South Africa's removal from AGOA. The Business Confidence Index, because that determines how South Africa is perceived. If South Africa is perceived to be a country that is becoming less attractive for foreign direct investment, then of course that begins to affect our, our investment, the gross fixed capital formation, which we've seen dwindling over the past 20 years. That is very difficult to quantify. The perception that would follow us being kicked out of that preferential treatment. But to just finish this point, I mean, if you look at the tariffs at the moment, you're looking at plus minus 5%. So you can still export stuff to the US. It won't be that expensive. But the point is that much of our export concentration in our basket falls outside this preferential treatment. Yeah.
Right. Now, the US economy, the European economy, are connected. Let's look at another scenario. The US decides to impose sanctions against South Africa when Donald Trump takes over. And Europe follows suit. And if you look at our top 3 trading partners in South Africa, and we talk Europe, China is there, obviously the US. What would the impact be for South African businesses?
I mean, if those two were to agree on sanctioning South Africa, which is highly unlikely, of course it would be catastrophic, without a doubt. But it's not a likely scenario. It's not a likely scenario. It's not a likely scenario. I think that there's a lot that the world needs from South Africa, and I've made this point earlier. I was talking to a friend and I was saying there's reciprocity, there's mutuality between ourselves and the United States. And this friend said to me, no. They need us more than we need them. So the repercussions of sanctioning South Africa, if you were to package a rather excruciating package of sanctions against the South African government and the South African economy, the world also has a bit to lose. And that's why I'm saying it's very difficult to imagine a situation where there would be consensus between Europe and the US to sanction South Africa. I think they're highly uncomfortable about our stance in many other aspects of global politics. And that's not about to stop, and that's been the case, as I was saying, since 94.
But then here's one example. The US imposed sanctions against Russia. EU imposed sanctions against Russia. A Russian company in South Africa, you want to trade with South Africa, you want to transact with South Africa. And now they're told you can't transact with the Russian company because US has actually imposed sanctions. In fact, I'm talking of something that happened recently at the airport, AXA. BP had to pull out because they couldn't refuel a Russian because of sanctions were imposed against Russia. So this risk is real because we are exposed to that risk. But imagine if that would happen.
No, absolutely. I mean, you can't underestimate the extent of trade and investment disruption that the sanctions that have been imposed on Russia has had on the global economy. Russian assets, of course, are under distress because most of them were dollar denominated. And of course it affects us because we have a very robust bilateral relations with Russia. And Russia is also part of the BRICS formation. And it will affect us in many ways. And you must understand that Americans are using the financial system to impose their will geopolitically. And that's the problem. Maybe it was important to just give a little bit of background, because what you have here is a global financial system which has been designed after the Second World War, designed by the U.S. to suit its own interest. The dollar, of course, is the currency of foreign reserve, of international settlement. We're all trading in dollars. And of course they did this at the time when the world was bipolar, without contestation, because the doctrine of the socialist East, the Russian doctrine, was antithesis to what the US had put together to run the financial system as we know it today. So now that we are here in the 21st century, post the Soviet Union, even Russian banks had to be exposed to this Western created financial architecture. And now the US is now using it as a tool for geopolitical influence, as a tool for exerting its own will. The world, and I think it's throwing us into another discussion, because there's now currency diversification, or de-dollarization, some people will call it, where the world is now considering countermeasures to say, in terms of risk mitigation, if the United States is so much in control of our own fiscal, our own monetary system, our own banking system, even here, what would happen if we have sanctions like you're talking about, where South African banks now all of a sudden can't use the infrastructure, like the SWIFT infrastructure. We can't do international transactions. So the world has now started a very important conversation, and I think it's still very much elementary at this point, but the conversation to try and diversify from that risk, to create a different architecture in terms of the financial system that would be able to insulate international transactions from the United States.